Okay, so this is chapter 14 in your book on the research that goes with the behavioral and social learning approach. All right, so first we're going to talk about individual differences in gender role behavior. So we're going to look at some of the reasons that might be behind this. We'll talk about biological differences a little bit later on, but for the relevance for this chapter, we're going to look at the role of the environment and how that can potentially lead to particular behaviors that are consistent with society's gender role expectations. So that could happen through operant conditioning, where we are rewarded for behaving in ways that are consistent with the role or the gender that you have. It could also be acquired through observational learning. All right, so our first approach here looks at this dimension of masculinity versus femininity and argues that those particular terms might be too emotionally laden for them to be used in research. So people might kind of be turned off to those particular kinds of terms. So instead, perhaps we could replace these with two terms called agency and communion. So agency might be more similar to our idea of masculinity, where we're looking at someone who has some degree of kind of putting themselves out there, right? Like some degree of self-promotion, of independence, this assertiveness, kind of being in charge. If you have agency, you're making your own decisions. Whereas with communion, this could be likened to femininity. With communion, we're more concerned about kind of coming together with other people. So relationships, cooperation, those kinds of things. Okay, so some of these models then to try to understand these gender role behaviors. If someone is considered to be androgynous, that means that the person shows kind of both masculine and feminine traits. So think agency plus communion. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here with androgyny. And then if we look at the research that tries to kind of give us some idea of understanding how gender type and a person's sense of well-being are connected to one another, we have three different models that are presented here. So the first one, this congruence model. So if something is congruent, that means that it matches. And in this case, we're looking at your behaviors match the stereotypical expectations for your gender. This particular model, the congruence model, is very rarely supported in research. So we'll move on then to models that have more research support. So our next one here is this masculinity model. So according to this particular model, we are looking at having agency, and that is the key to mental health. So for this particular one, we're looking at people who are independent, who are problem focused, who have that sense of agency. And this one actually does have a decent amount of research support. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about the research on locus of control and mental health. And then our last one here is the androgyny model. And so this particular one basically states that you need both agency and communion, those masculine and feminine traits, to be successful, to have some degree of well-being. And this one also is robustly supported in the literature. The conclusions, though, here are to be taken cautiously. There's no real firm conclusions that can be drawn. We're still not exactly sure what the relationship is between gender role behavior and well-being. So the jury's still out on this one. We need more research to make more definitive statements here. Okay, so gender type then in interpersonal relationships, we're basically looking here at kind of why do people who have these communion or more feminine traits and androgynous people, why are they preferable partners? So why do people basically want to be in relationships with individuals who have those particular traits? Well, research shows us that people who have these higher levels of feminine traits tend to be kind of more in tune to other people's needs. And that makes sense, right? If we think about communion and kind of a coming together. So they're more aware of other people's needs. They're more attuned to other people's needs. They tend to be more sensitive, have good communication skills, and oftentimes also avoiding unnecessary conflicts, right? Kind of considering how is this going to impact another person before I actually engage in it. So generally speaking, we see higher levels of satisfaction in relationships where the person is married to or coupled with someone who does have these feminine traits. Okay, so remember, that's not just women, right? Men could have feminine traits as well. Okay, so a variation of communion is something called unmitigated communion. So we've talked about the upsides of communion, or the feminine traits. This is one of the downsides of communion. So this particular form of communion, this unmitigated communion, basically means that some people will kind of sacrifice their own self-interests to take care of other people. And you can probably think of people that you know who do this, and oftentimes it's at a serious detriment to their own mental health. So people who have this unmitigated communion, generally speaking, see their personal worth as essentially tied to what other people think of them. Correlates of this include difficulty asserting the self, so kind of showing that agency, putting yourself out there with your wants and needs, a fear that expressing my own personal wants and my own personal feelings will lead to some degree of conflict. And this makes people who have this unmitigated communion very vulnerable to exploitation. So other people might really take advantage of the fact that they know, these people are never going to push back. They're never going to assert their own wants and needs. And you can see here also that we see some other detrimental outcomes as well. So low measures of overall well-being, low measures of self-esteem, and higher measures of depression for people who have this unmitigated communion. So then you might be thinking, what's the opposite? So the opposite then is this unmitigated agency. And so with unmitigated agency, we're looking essentially at a form of narcissism where the individual is so hyper-focused on his or her own self and own wants and own needs to the neglect of essentially anyone else. It's like, I only care about me. I don't care about anyone else. So this is like a hyper-narcissism. Their interactions with other people tend to be very unpleasant, if you can imagine interacting with someone who only cares about his or her own needs to the neglect of other people's. And they also tend to be very strained. So their interpersonal relationships are not quality relationships. They're not good relationships. And then these people are also oftentimes very reluctant to seek or receive help from other people. So this gets in the way, right, of them being able to really form solid relationships. Okay, so then moving into the social cognitive theory and focusing in particular on Bandura's four-step model of observational learning, and we're going to apply this in particular to research on aggression. So if you guys remember from child development and probably general psychology as well, that Bandura posited that one of the ways that children learn aggression is through aggressive modeling. And so remember, for that to happen, the person needs to pay attention, they need to remember the information, then they need to be able to retain it, they need to be able to reproduce it, and then we also need to have some degree of motivation. So some expectation that this is going to produce a positive outcome for me, right? That this is going to produce some kind of outcome that's desirable. So research does show this particular relationship fairly robustly. Most studies do find that viewing aggression actually does increase the likelihood of the person also imitating that behavior in future interactions. We can look at exposure to violent television programming over the course of a day, and then look at the relationship between that and likelihood of aggressive behavior. So if you look at the data from this particular study, Johnson et al. In 2002, they essentially found that for individuals who watched more television per day, and you see the effect is especially strong for men, right, for males, that they were then more likely to engage in violent behavior later on down the line. Okay, so keeping in mind then that this is a complicated issue, it's not just that the person is exposed to violence and then this begets aggressive behavior. There are many intervening variables here, but this is one potential pathway to kind of understand where violent behavior may come from. All right, so let's link this then to the research in learned helplessness. So we talked about learned helplessness in class, but remember that learned helplessness essentially is the perception that I've tried and tried and tried to enact some kind of agency, right, some kind of control, and all of the things that I do don't seem to work. So I might as well give up, right? I might as well engage in some degree of futility. In addition, there can sometimes be an observational learning component here as well, where people might learn some degree of helplessness just by watching other people enact that particular behavior. So learned helplessness is widely studied within the field. So we're going to talk about some applications here. So one application is in working with the elderly. So for older adults, there is a lot of literature that shows, especially for older adults who are in nursing homes, right, and think like managed care, assisted living kinds of facilities, that giving them some degree of control over the environment greatly improves their sense of general well-being, their sense of motivation. Taking that control away, so basically doing everything for this person, can actually undermine the person's sense of agency and can lead to this sense of learned helplessness. It can almost like create the climate where the person starts to think, well, I guess I'm not capable of doing anything if everyone has to do it for me, so I might as well give up. And so in some of these studies, they did really simple kinds of things. So they would give elderly individuals in a nursing home a plant to take care of. And on one floor in the nursing home, the individuals would tell them that you are responsible. So you as the resident, you're responsible for taking care of this plant. This plant is completely within your power, your control. And then on another floor, they would tell the residents that I will take care of this plant for you, meaning someone who works there, right? Someone who's on staff will take care of this plant for you. You don't need to worry about it. I can handle it. I'm the one who's in charge here. And they found essentially that those who had a plant to take care of reported higher levels of well-being, that they also were more engaged in the kinds of activities that are involved in a nursing facility. So something pretty simple, but could have pretty dramatic effects. All right, learned helplessness then in relation to psychological disorders. So we talked about this in class, especially in relation to depression. We can kind of understand, right, that for people who have depression, you know, the perception is I've tried everything, I've tried kind of over and over and over again, and nothing here really does seem to work. And so there is a robust amount of literature that looks at this as, you know, an important model to help us really understand where depression comes from. All right, so our next concept here refers to what's called locus of control. So with locus of control, there's internal versus external locus of control. With an internal locus of control, this is basically believing that I am the one who makes things happen. I am in charge. I am in control, you know, of my life. Good things happen because I make them happen. Whereas with an external locus of control, this is kind of more the mindset that things happen to me. You know, things are controlled by fate. Things are controlled by destiny. Things are controlled by something outside of me, as opposed to, you know, I am the person who's in control. So you can probably see then how this can relate pretty easily to well-being in terms of psychological disorders. So psychological disorders, we tend to see that individuals who have more of an external locus of control, kind of believing that things are out of their control, things are out of their power, are more likely to have psychological disorders, in particular depression, right? I mean, one of the things that characterizes depression is this kind of mindset that I have no power to change things, right? And like things just happen. And that mindset of hopelessness, you know, if I think that no matter what I do, it doesn't really matter, well, then I'm going to believe that someone else is controlling things and it's not me who's in charge. And then that can lead to higher instances of things like depression. So applied to college students then, looking at an achievement orientation. So a lot of literature shows us that students who have this internal locus of control, generally speaking, tend to receive higher grades and also to be more favorably evaluated by their teachers compared to those with an external locus of control. So why is this the case? Well, the first one that's fairly obvious is that if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that the reason that you do well in school is that you work at it, that you work hard, and that this is all within your power and within your control. So I am responsible for both my achievement, but then I'm also responsible for my failure as well. And if I want to change that, well, then I'm going to change my behavior. And then for internals, then they're basically saying that I do well because I worked hard, right? I do well because I studied. I do well because I have the particular ability in this area versus attributing it to some kind of external cause. So thinking, well, I did well just because it's an easy class, or I did well because the teacher taught the material really well. So those things are externalities. Those things outside of you are not, it turns out, related to higher achievement. So you control this. In addition, there are some other things that make internals a little bit working more favorably in terms of academic achievement. So for internals, they are better at taking critical feedback and using it. So if I believe that I'm essentially responsible for my successes, well, I'm going to take what someone else is telling me and use that to incorporate to get better. And then they use that information as it directly relates to their goals. And then they also tend to be a lot more ambitious compared to external locus of control students. So the ambition then is related to, well, if I believe I'm in charge and I'm in control, well, then I'm going to have high expectations for myself, and I'm going to make myself reach those expectations, compared to thinking that, doesn't really matter, right? Like, I'm in the right place at the right time, and that's why I do well. That would be more of an external orientation. All right, so then in terms of psychotherapy, we see some developmental changes as clients go through therapy. So oftentimes clients will start with a more external locus of control, but then over the course of therapy, they develop typically some sense of agency and some sense of internal locus of control, meaning that they move from believing perhaps that other people are controlling outcomes to, well, I'm ultimately responsible for the outcomes. Additionally, then, in some cases, people who have an external locus of control will, in some research studies, have been shown to actually do better when treatment remains in the therapist's hands. So meaning when the therapist still exercises a significant amount of control, whereas internals seem to do better when they are handed the reins, right, where they are actually handed the ability to make decisions about their treatment. Okay, so locus of control then also relates to your physical health. Generally speaking, internals tend to have better physical health than externals. So internals, again, if you believe that the decisions that you make ultimately influence the outcome and that you have control over these things, well then, I'm probably going to do things like exercise. I'm probably going to try to eat well. I'm going to follow whatever recommendations come to me from medical professionals about how to take care of myself. If I believe that those things make a difference, compared to someone who is external, who doesn't tend to have those same kinds of beliefs. So this is data from a research study that basically looked at how to tailor a public health message based on the person's locus of control. So this is pretty interesting. So they found that people were more likely to go and get a mammogram, which, as you guys probably know, is preventative for breast cancer. That they were more likely to actually go and get this preventative care when they receive a message that's consistent with their locus of control. So for internals, so if you have an internal locus of control, if you received a message that is directed at your internal sense of control. So for internals, they told them the best thing you can do for your health is go and get a mammogram. And then for externals, they told them that the best thing that science can do is to go and get a mammogram. Okay, so the best thing that science can do, so something that is outside of the person. And they found that when the person received the message that was consistent with his, well, her in this case, right, with her locus of control, that she was then actually more likely to go and get a mammogram. So some evidence here then, applications to psychotherapy, right? That, you know, if we're giving our clients messages that are consistent with their locus of control, they might actually be more likely to follow the recommendations or more likely to engage in that treatment.